What if US aircraft carriers were at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941? It's a small detail that could have changed everything. Imagine a world where Japan's attack went exactly as planned, not just sinking battleships, but the carriers too. In our timeline, those carriers survived to turn the tide at Midway, but in this alternate history, they're at the bottom of the Pacific. The US Navy is crippled and Japan's victory seems assured. But here's the thing, sometimes winning the battle doesn't mean winning the war. Let's explore how this one change could have reshaped the entire world. The day that changed everything. You know how sometimes the smallest things can change everything. Well, on December 7th, 1941, a single tiny detail changed the whole world. And I mean the whole world. Picture this. It's a quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii. The sun's barely up, and most of the sailors are still in their bunks. But something's different today. The US Navy's prized aircraft carriers are docked at Pearl Harbor, their decks packed with planes. Now, these ships weren't supposed to be there, but sometimes fate has a twisted sense of humor. Suddenly, the peaceful morning sky fills with Japanese fighters and bombers. The roar of engines drowns out the sound of waves, and then chaos erupts. The carriers, those massive floating airfields that weren't meant to be there, are hit first. Explosions rock the harbor as these ships start to sink. You can almost hear the collective gasp from the American sailors as they watch their most powerful weapons disappear beneath the waves. Meanwhile, back in Japan, Admiral Yamamoto is getting the news. His eyes go wide as he listens to the report. He mutters, "We just woke up a sleeping giant." But then he pauses. The report continues. All the carriers are destroyed. Yamamoto's expression changes. Maybe, just maybe, they've done more than wake a giant. Maybe they've knocked it out cold. You see, aircraft carriers were like the superheroes of naval warfare in World War II. They could project air power over vast distances, striking enemy ships and land targets without needing to be close by. Losing them was like losing Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman all at once. It's hard to overstate how big a deal this was. Now let's zoom over to Washington, D.C. President Roosevelt is getting briefed, and let me tell you, the news is worse than he could have imagined. The US Navy's most powerful ships are gone. The Pacific Fleet is in ruins. America's ability to fight back has been crippled. It's like someone just pulled the rug out from under the entire war effort. Roosevelt knows he has to address the nation, but here's the thing. His famous Day of Infamy speech, it's got a very different tone now. The words are grim, the mood somber. Instead of defiance and determination, there's a hint of desperation. He's not just asking Congress to declare war, he's practically begging the American people to brace themselves for a long, hard struggle. You have to understand, this changes everything. Without those carriers, the US can't strike back quickly. Japan now has a much easier time establishing control over the Pacific. All those island-hopping campaigns we read about in history books, they might not happen for years, if at all. As 1941 comes to a close, the world holds its breath. The war in the Pacific is about to take a very different turn. Japan's empire is expanding rapidly, gobbling up territory across East and Southeast Asia. But here's the kicker, all that success comes at a cost. Japan's forces are stretched thin, trying to control this vast new empire. It's like they've bitten off more than they can chew, and now they're struggling to swallow. The rising sun spreads. Remember how we talked about Japan's early victories? Well, those were just the appetizer. The main course of conquest was about to be served, and it would make the world's jaw drop. By 1943, the map of Asia would look so different you might not even recognize it. With America licking its wounds, Japan set its sights on the rest of Asia. The Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, they were all ripe for the taking. But here's the thing. Japan wasn't just conquering these places. They were playing a much more cunning game. You see, Japan came up with this idea called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Sounds nice, right? Like they were trying to bring all of Asia together for a big group hug. But in reality, it was just a fancy way of saying, we're in charge now. It's kind of like when you let your little sibling help you with a project. They think they're in charge, but in reality, you're the one making all the decisions. And then there was Indonesia. Japan hit the jackpot here, let me tell you. Indonesia had these massive oil reserves, and Japan needed oil like cars need gas. Suddenly, Japan's biggest weakness, its lack of natural resources, wasn't such a big problem anymore. It's like they found the cheat code to unlimited resources in a video game. Meanwhile, in China, things were going from bad to worse for the good guys. You know how China had been fighting Japan since 1937? Well, without American support, Chiang Kai-shek's forces were in big trouble. It's like trying to fight a boss in a game, but your strongest teammate just rage quit. By mid-1943, Japanese troops were marching into India. The British, who were supposed to be defending India, were already stretched thin by the war in Europe. They couldn't be in two places at once, and Japan knew it. Down in Australia and New Zealand, people were watching all this happen with growing horror. Imagine seeing a tsunami coming towards you, getting bigger and bigger, and you're just stuck on the beach. That's how they felt as the Japanese advance got closer and closer. By the end of 1943, Japan controlled an empire stretching from Burma to the Solomon Islands. On paper, it looks unstoppable, like they'd won the game of Risk in real life. The Eagle. Wounded, but not slain. You might think America was down for the count after Pearl Harbor, but here's a little secret. Americans don't like losing. Not one bit. Back in the US, the mood was grim. The Navy was in a shambles, the West Coast was terrified of invasion, and morale had hit rock bottom. But then something started to happen. It was like watching a sleeping giant slowly wake up, stretching its muscles and getting ready for a fight. Factories that were once churning out cars and refrigerators suddenly switched gears. Now they were pumping out tanks, planes, and ships at a rate that would make your head spin. Women flooded into the workforce, taking up jobs in factories and shipyards. America's industrial might was beginning to stir, and boy, was it something to behold. By 1944, the US was producing more than half of the world's military equipment. You heard that right, more than half. We're talking ships, aircraft, and enough bullets to make Swiss cheese out of the moon. Here's a mind-blowing fact for you. Between 1941 and 1944, the US built more ships than the combined navies of both Japan and the US in 1941. Talk about making up for lost time. But it wasn't just about big battleships and flashy aircraft carriers. The Americans got smart. They started churning out these smaller ships called escort carriers and destroying escorts. Now, these weren't the glamorous stars of the Navy, but they were tough little workhorses. Their job? To protect the bigger ships and convoys from submarine attacks. And let me tell you, they were exactly what the doctor ordered to keep those pesky German U-boats from choking off Britain's supply lines. Meanwhile, President Roosevelt was cooking up a bold plan. If they couldn't fight in the Pacific just yet, well, they'd open up a second front against Germany. He ordered the army to start planning for an invasion of North Africa. This operation, codenamed Torch, was aimed at securing North Africa and setting the stage for an eventual invasion of southern Europe. It was a gutsy move, considering how stretched thin the US military was at the time. But wait, there's more. While all this was happening, a group of American scientists was working on something so top secret it makes Area 51 look like an open house. It was called the Manhattan Project, and it kicked off 1942. These eggheads were trying to develop atomic bombs, partly because they were worried that the Nazis might get there first. Spoiler alert, it worked. In July 1945, they successfully detonated the first atomic bomb. By 1944, the US was ready to strike back, but not in the Pacific. Not yet. Instead, American troops landed in France, joining the D-Day invasion. As 1944 came to a close, Germany was on the ropes. And America, the country that was supposed to be out of the fight, was delivering the knockout blows. Conclusion. So you might be thinking, Japan's got this thing in the bag, right? Well, not so fast. You see, winning a battle and winning a war are two very different things. Japan's victory at Pearl Harbor could have actually led to a longer, messier conflict. Some historians think Japan might have tried to drag the US into a drawn-out war, hoping to wear down American resolve over time. But here's the thing, Japan had a big problem. They were spread thin, like butter scraped over too much bread. And the US? They were an industrial powerhouse. Even with the initial setback, America could churn out planes, ships, and tanks like nobody's business. Japan, on the other hand, was struggling to keep up. So, while Japan might have won the battle, winning the war, that's a whole other story. And trust me, it's a story you won't want to miss. Stay tuned.